Recording started. Is the recording started?
It started, Doctor.
All right, so we'll start. Good morning, everyone in United States, and good evening, our viewers all over the world, including in India. Welcome to yet another roundtable discussion by Council for Strategic Affairs. My name is Dr. Adityanji, and I am the president of Council for Strategic Affairs. We have a very detailed discussion on the Ukraine crisis and superpower games that we are going to have. And all of you who registered for this probably saw this flyer specifying 3 of our distinguished experts for today's roundtable conference. A little bit of information about our Council for Strategic Affairs. Council for Strategic Affairs imparts education in the field of international relations. CSA fosters discussion, dialogue, and debate on geopolitical issues. CSA encourages strategic studies in general to raise the level of awareness. CSA aims to contribute towards world peace and prosperity. And lastly, CSA condemns terrorism in any form worldwide. We have no sympathy for terrorism. What are our activities? We have a monthly roundtable discussion on second Saturday of each month at 10 a.m. Eastern Daytime, that is New York time, and that is 8:30 p.m. India time. We have a monthly guest lecture by a domain expert on the fourth Saturday or the final Saturday, depending upon convenience of each month. CSA has been organizing symposia, meetings, and conferences. CSA also promotes publication of articles on geopolitics and related subjects. And more recently, CSA has started organizing a summer internship program for college students. So today's distinguished panel, we started with 3 panel members: Lieutenant General Syed Atta Hasnain, Major General Dhruv Katoch, and Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor. But in between, I did get a call from somebody else, and I'll see if that panel member is here. I will also introduce him. So our first panel member is General Hasnain. And I can say with confidence that General Hasnain does not need any introduction. He's such a well-known person. He's former General Commanding of 15 Corps based in Srinagar, 21 Corps, and was Military Secretary. Throughout 40 years of his illustrious career, General Hasnain has served turbulent environment and hotspots, from Sri Lanka to Siachen Glacier, from Northeast to Jammu and Kashmir. In UN operations from Mozambique to Rwanda, he has seen it all. Actually, he has a very impressive resume, and the President of India appointed Lieutenant General Hasnain as Chancellor of Central University of Kashmir. He received 6 decorations awarded by the President of India and 2 by the Army Chief. He is superannuated from the Indian Army in July 2018 after 40 years of service. And I must say that he has been gracious enough to come on our forum previously, today, and he will be coming in future as well. So he is our first distinguished speaker. Let me introduce our second distinguished speaker who just joined. And you are seeing his picture. He is Professor Walter K. Anderson III. Now, a little bit about Professor Walter Anderson. Professor Walter Anderson earned his PhD degree in political science from the University of Chicago. Till very recently, he was a program director at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and he recently retired as senior adjunct professor of South Asia Studies at Johns Hopkins Paul H. Nietzsche School of Advanced International Studies. He was also part of the faculty at Tongji University in Shanghai in China. He has taught comparative politics at the College of Worcester before joining the US State Department as a political analyst for South Asia, specializing in India and Indian Ocean affairs. And I am very proud to say that he has a serious love connection with India, whatever it means. As part of his fieldwork, he lived in India for 4 years from late 1960s through early 1970s. He has written books on several aspects of India, and he'll tell you sort of himself, uh, what his other connection with India is. I'll leave it to him. Our next distinguished speaker is Major General Dhruv Katoj. Major General Dhruv Katoj is an alumnus of Sherwood College in Nainital. He has been to National Defense Academy in Khadagwasla in India, National Defense College. He was commissioned to join the Dogra Regiment on March 31st, 1972. Again, in a very distinguished career that spanned nearly 4 decades, he has held instructional assignments in the infantry school in military headquarters of war, the Indian Military Academy in Dehradun. He has had senior staff appointments in various corps levels. He was general officer and graduate of the High Command course at MHOW. He has vast experience in subconventional conflict, having taken part in IPKF operations in Sri Lanka, in operations against terrorists and insurgents in Jammu and Kashmir and various states of northeast India. He was commended by the Chief of Army Staff for operations against militants in Sri Lanka and was awarded the Sena Medal while in command of his battalion in active operations on the line of control in Jammu and Kashmir. After commanding a sector and division in the Northeast India, he subsequently retired as Chief of Staff of the Operations Corps. He writes regularly on defense and security related issues. And again, I am proud to say this is not the first time he is appearing for Council for Strategic Affairs, and he has been a regular guest at our forum. And last but not the least, our most distinguished speaker is Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor. Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor is currently a visiting clinical professor, international trade, development and security issues at the School of Public Policy in University of Maryland. He joined the Indian Foreign Services in 1979 and he attained the rank of Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India in 2013. Described as a luminary diplomat, he was first in his batch to be appointed as ambassador in the year 2000. He has served first as India's ambassador to the Kingdom of Cambodia and later as ambassador to the Republic of Chile. He is a dear friend, very well-known author and media personality, and again he has been several times on our forum. He has written multiple books, is an expert, distinguished expert and panel member. So I will leave it at that and go on to the subject. Subject is the Ukraine crisis. And this is the map of Ukraine, just to give an orientation. And of course, this is the flag of Ukraine. Actually, the Ukrainians call it Ukraine. So whatever you are comfortable with, Ukraine or Ukraine, that's fine. And these are the two gentlemen who are at the center of this crisis. Before I go on to our speakers, I just want to see a couple of things. This shows actually the NATO's expansion because there are some issues about this issue. And this actually slide shows NATO in 1998 and NATO in 2022. Couple of housekeeping rules for our audience. Please mute yourself to avoid noise interference. Please change your cell phone settings to vibration mode. Please do not try to interrupt our esteemed speakers while they are speaking. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves openly will be allowed to pose questions. So if people have joined anonymously, they will not be allowed to ask questions. All the questions have to be sent through chat function. We will not take direct questions. Please be precise and specific in asking a question. Please don't write a detailed lecture or comments in the form of a monologue. It has to be a precise question. Lastly, we are recording this event and it should be available on our YouTube channel within next 24 hours. And as I said, our first distinguished speaker is Lieutenant General Ata Hasnain. General Hasnain, kindly unmute yourself and you will be introducing the Ukraine crisis and of course now Ukraine war to our audience. Floor is yours, sir, General Hasnain.
Thank you very much, Aditanji Saab, and my compliments and greetings to my fellow panelists and to all our viewers. May I also just know, Aditanji, what is the time limit? How much time are you allotting us?
General Saab, you have around 15 minutes to make this presentation.
Great. That's exactly what I was seeking. Thank you very much, and I think that in 15 minutes we can convey a lot. Thank you for this selecting a very appropriate subject. 17th day today. We don't seem to be heading anywhere. So the first thought which comes to my mind when I'm speaking about Ukraine at this juncture is about unpredictability. It's all about unpredictability. Geopolitical unpredictability is about military unpredictability. It is about diplomatic unpredictability, and it's about economic unpredictability. So a little bit on each of them, but before that, a small touchdown on the backdrop. My mind, when I look at Ukraine and I look at this crisis, my mind goes to the Treaty of Versailles, 1919. The drama that you're seeing enacted here was enacted exactly in the same way in 1919. Germany was a defeated power. The management of victory and the management of defeat eluded the Allies, and they ended up only creating a Germany with a high degree of German nationalism, which in 20 years' time led to World War II. The rise of Hitler, the rise of Nazism, World War II. Cut that and you come to 1989.
और उसमें तुम ये कर सकते हो जैसे उसमें तुम ये कर सकते हो जैसे हम लोग जो लाए थे ना वो तो
Gentleman, old Sanjay, who is speaking on his. May I request that everyone kindly mute? Have a look at your mute button. There will be a cross on it if you have actually muted yourself. Right. Yeah. So the chain of thought just goes with this. So 1980, cut to 1989, the Cold War about to end, the Berlin Wall having fallen. 1991, the Soviet Union broke up, Warsaw Pact got dismantled, and once again the whole question came up of the management of victory and defeat. This is something which I think humankind has never been able to understand and never been able to learn. When you score a victory of this nature, how should you really manage it? In this case, once again, NATO, led by the United States, ensured that, first of all, NATO continued to remain NATO. NATO had been created primarily for security of Western Europe, the United States, all the allies, against the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact, all their allies during the Cold War. Many people question as to what was the necessity for NATO to continue after 1991. But nevertheless, it remained, and you saw that NATO even fought the war in Afghanistan. They have just withdrawn from there. Obviously, in a hurry to pressurize, in a hurry to cement the victory of 1991, the end of the Cold War, which looked like a victory, everyone was in a hurry to ensure that you got the maximum out of it. Former Warsaw Pact countries started applying to join NATO. Former republics of the Soviet Union started applying, and you saw over a period of time the applications actually being accepted, materializing around 2003, 2004 onwards. From 14 nations or so, if I remember correctly, it rose up to 29 nations. And that was the figure ultimately what NATO achieved. Now, while all this was happening, Russia was weak, could not really do very much. It was managing its own internal issues, trying to remain secure, keeping itself afloat, managing the post-Cold War internal issues. As I said, the aspect of nuclearization, the aspect of nuclear weapons, lots and lots of things had to be managed at that time. It was not in a position to push back, so not much happened. The advance of NATO, the registration with NATO continued at the pace which NATO was looking at. By 2014, it was very, very clear that Russia was not willing to accept anything beyond the red lines it had established. Ukraine was a country which NATO was looking at absorbing as a part of its own organization. But when you look at it geostrategically, not geopolitically, geostrategically, one realizes that the location of NATO was such, and the map was just shown by Adityanji also. The map, you can see Ukraine on the map, the manner it juts out into the innards of Russia. This was the problem with Georgia too, as you found in 2008, the pushback by Russia. 2014, once again, it was decided that the pushback would take place. One of the major reasons for Ukraine also was the fact that the access into the Black Sea for Russia was through Ukraine. The Donbass area, the Sea of Azov, and the Black Sea. The very, very strategic port of Sevastopol was located here in Crimea. If Ukraine went away, Russia's access into the Black Sea, and therefore not just the access to Black Sea, but the access into the Mediterranean would then become questionable. And that is something which was really a red line, which actually not too many people talk about, but it was one of the major red lines for this. And in 2014, the pushback happened. Crimea was taken over. Donbass was virtually invaded, and the commencement of an 8-year hybrid war started then. Who won the hybrid war is not necessarily not important for us to outline. What happened in 2022? From 2021, this build-up it was taking place around Ukraine. What was the necessity for it? I have analyzed this very deeply in my own mind, and I continue to maintain that Russia would not cross the Rubicon. It would not go to war. It had achieved what it wanted to achieve through hybrid conflict over 8 years. It had Crimea in its hands. It had Donbass virtually in its hands. There was a Russian majority in most of these areas. And by virtue of the control of the southern portions of Ukraine, the Odessa, etc., which could always be sort of pressurized from the south, it had Ukraine virtually in its fold. It is not as if Ukraine was just going away from the Russian fold. So it looked very unlikely that Russia would invest in actually invading Ukraine. it appeared that when it finally took the decision to do it, perhaps there were 2 or 3 things which were in the mind of the Russian leader, Mr. Putin himself. No one could predict his mind. Number one, no one knew what was the effect on his mind with COVID over the last 2 years. But he was essentially looking to prove a point when the United States and the European Union appeared to be looking weak. And in the post-Afghanistan situation in particular, in the last 6 months, the US leadership, largely the leadership in most of Europe, Germany had just changed its leadership. It seemed to be a situation in which the overall leadership of the Western world was weaker than what it was in the past. This was something perhaps very, very tempting at that particular time. What Mr. Putin wanted to finally actually achieve is still really not. Was this instigated by China? Well, the last meeting between Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping appeared, a lot of people appear to read a lot into it to say that the trigger finally came from this particular meeting, and it appeared that the Russians were keen to take away the focus from the Indo-Pacific. It was something in conjunction with China that they were looking at, taking away the focus from the Indo-Pacific and bringing it into one of the theaters of conflict which had not been in conventional conflict for long. To my mind, there are 4 major theaters of conflict today. There is the Middle East or West Asia. There is Central Asia, covering the new Great Game region, which is Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, stretching even into Jammu and Kashmir and places like that. The third is the Indo-Pacific. And the fourth, once again, a return to it, is the area of Europe. So was this an attempt to try and take away the focus from the Indo-Pacific and bring it back to the theater here? No one really knows. So these were just some of the issues which come to mind immediately. Look at the military unpredictability of it. Mr. Putin seemed to be overconfident. He seemed to be extremely confident of his armed forces. But if anything has been proven in the last 17 days, it is the fact that the Russian armed forces, which used to be revered at one time, and many of you would probably recall during the Cold War, the study we used to do of Russian Soviet doctrines, the operational maneuver group and things like that, fighting against the air-land battle, which NATO had as a doctrine. We used to look at all this. In India, particularly, where we have 60-70% of the equipment which comes from Russia, many of our leaders, tactical and sub-tactical leaders, have got educated in Russian institutions. We used to rever the concepts and doctrines of the Russian armed forces. In 17 days, this seems to have shaken completely. Was Mr. Putin overconfident? It seems to be. More than that, it seems the leadership, the Russian military leadership, was overconfident. Am I saying too much? Or am I actually alluding to what a lot of people are saying is a tremendous amount of American psychological warfare and information warfare coming out? Am I actually believing in all that? Well, I don't want to pass judgment on it. But if this is what the American information war is achieving, it is achieving a hell of a lot. Because on the ground, what is manifesting is quite clear that the Russians are not making headway. They did not use air power to the required degree in the first 3 to 5 days. Most conventional armies go for air superiority on the first 3 to 5 days. They couldn't achieve it. With the kind of superiority of resources, this is something which was a given. They didn't do it. We learned that their logistics ran out after 72 hours. Even the supplies, basic supplies and fuel ran out, because of which a number of armored vehicles were strung along all the roads all over. It seems that the armored vehicles were not even leaving the roads. Many of them were strung all along roads. We hear of the famous 64-kilometer long convoy of armored vehicles north of Kyiv, waiting to attack Kyiv. I don't know when that attack will finally come. We are still waiting for Christmas, perhaps. So a lot of things which are unpredictable. Tremendous disinformation, tremendous information war going on from both sides. We are aware of what the Russians are doing in terms of keeping away all information from the Russian public. The Russian public has no idea of what is really happening on the Ukrainian front. After the first 5 days, Russians have gone into a hype. Now, on the last few days, they were attempting to get into the cities. What they've achieved is they've taken one city in the south, they've blockaded the Black Sea ports, Odessa, northeast, eastwards, all blockaded, obviously. So there's a virtual economic blockade from the sea. They have commenced their operations from all along the northern front, from the Donbass front, but they've left the complete western front open. Obviously, those are the areas which are bordering the new NATO countries of Poland and Hungary and countries like that. That has all been left open. For what particular reason? To allow the weaponry to come inside from NATO? I'm not sure. Or is it a little too awkward to be able to address that particular area? Because the war could spread across the borders in those areas. One really doesn't know. So, what will be the scenario today? Now, I now come to what Ukraine is actually doing. We hear from the Ukrainian president, Mr. Zelensky, that they are virtually fighting what is known among us infantrymen as the last man, last round battle. Why is he doing this? While at the same time, he is making a statement to say that Ukraine will not join NATO. Then what is the compulsion to fight this last man, last round battle? So again, this issue of military unpredictability. What comes to my mind is that you have on one side an unpredictable president who has launched an invasion, and here you have an unpredictable president who does not know how to respond, who thinks that the best form of response is only a military response. Well, many of us will probably question and say they have the right to defend themselves. Yes, absolutely. They have the fullest right to defend themselves. But if you're going to fight a protracted war and you do not have the resources to fight a protracted war, is it prudence? Is it wisdom to allow your nation to be laid waste? To allow mass casualties of your population? And at the end of it, capitulate? I'm not sure whether he'll be a war hero or actually a war criminal. So these are some of the issues of unpredictability that we can talk about. Of course, there have been a lot of humanitarian considerations which is being spoken about, that the Russians actually had humanitarian considerations because of which they didn't use air power against the cities in the beginning. But all that is now thrown to the winds because the manner in which the cities are being addressed, obviously, there is this issue cannot be believed any longer. Economically, there's a major effect which is taking place. We have seen that the United States-led NATO, Western powers, are unwilling to put boots on ground as a response to defend who would have been a NATO member. Obviously, since Ukraine is not a NATO member, none of the provisions of the NATO constitution, the NATO requirements are actually met. So they cannot come with boots on ground. But yes, a tremendous amount of effort to provide the resources to fight the war is continuing. Is this, again, a very prudent thing to do? Is this a prudent thing to do at this stage? To instigate and get a much weaker nation to fight almost to the last man, last round, based upon a tremendous amount of equipment surge which is being made into Ukraine at this time. Again, a very unpredictable issue. Again, something which needs a commentary. Lots of people will have a different opinion about this. NATO and the Western world is looking at economics as the weapon, sanctions. I'm not sure how much the sanctions are going to affect. Of course, a lot of things are being spoken about, a lot of analyses are being done. $600 billion in the pipelines, supposedly at one time in the entire banking systems and the banking arrangements seems to have all been frozen. How is this going to affect Russia? This is something for us to look at. Where can Russia bear this loss? Can its currency arrangements with China, new arrangements with other nations, can they work themselves out to create alternative financial arrangements in the world? It will take time for it, obviously, to do. But while all this is happening, does Russia have the capability to continue this war? That is the questionable thing. The primacy of the petrodollar in the economic domain. the whole issue which is being discussed tremendously today, whether the United States is attempting to do all this primarily as a promotion of its military industrial complex, is the other aspect which needs to be kept in mind. So can the US accept a Russian domination of Ukraine and the pushback which has taken place from Russia at this stage? Can it accept it? If Ukraine capitulates tomorrow, what is likely to be the response? Can there be a proxy war fought in Ukraine by NATO? NATO hasn't fought a proxy war after the 80s. In the 80s, they fought a proxy wars against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan with the assistance of Pakistan. Pakistan was the frontline state then. Can that be repeated today to create an Afghanistan for the Russians in Ukraine again? The Afghanistan situation and Central and East European situation appear to be quite different. It may not be so easy to be able to fight this kind of a proxy war, a hybrid war here. Let me take last 2 minutes. The issues which come to light as far as the larger picture is concerned. It seems that the efforts that the United States was making after getting out, first of all, the decision to get out of Afghanistan in a hurry, in the manner that they didn't draw very great appreciation from any part of the world. But all that was supposedly for getting back the focus to the Indo-Pacific to prevent the rise, not so peaceful rise of China. Can that continue? Or is it that now with the situation as it is at the moment, the entire NATO gaze is going to be once again on Europe, areas which we found after the Cold War, the areas of Bosnia, Herzegovina, and places, Kosovo, and places like that, which kept the world's focus also at that time for a couple of years. Are we coming back to such a situation where you're seeing the mass movement of refugees? Over 1.5 million refugees have moved into Europe all over. Lastly, on India, this military unpredictability, can it actually help us? It's not a given that a superpower or a former superpower, a rump state of a superpower, can just go in and create the conditions for military victory. It's becoming very, very evident from what the situation is. Obviously, the Chinese would be reading this situation too. And here you have a situation in eastern Ladakh and the northern borders where China and India are ranged against each other. I think this would require a tremendous amount of analysis now, and this is something fresh for us to look at it. Our neutrality should not be considered the old non-aligned type of neutrality. I call this neutrality as informed neutrality. Each time that we have taken a neutral stance, we have always made a statement and explained our stance. We have also called for a prevention, for an end to war, to end to hostilities. But at the same time, we have maintained our neutrality thus far. How long more can this happen? If this war elongates, it goes into a proxy war, is something for us to look at. Obviously, clear sides in a situation such as this for a rising power such as India, a rising middle power such as India, is something that may not be expected for quite some time. Thank you. I think I'll stop here. And I've covered a lot of ground, but I'm open for questions at any time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, General Hasnain. What a brilliant and incisive historical and military analysis of the contemporary problem we are facing, the entire world is facing. And I think you have done a, brilliant job trying to explain the situation very cogently. I'm sure there'll be questions that we will take at end, but I will follow on to our next distinguished panelist. And as I had already introduced to all of you, he is Professor Walter Anderson, recently retired from School of Advanced International Studies from Johns Hopkins University. He will be speaking to us perhaps around 10 minutes or so, mainly giving the US point of view. And let's start with Professor Anderson's presentation. The floor is yours, sir. Please unmute yourself. Professor Anderson, please unmute yourself.
interpreted.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now, Professor.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate your inviting me to this session, which is a very important issue and likely to become much more dangerous issue as well for a number of reasons. You mentioned my love interest for India. It may not be what many of you know, unless you know me personally. My wife is an Indian, and she arrived in India today. She has a factory that manufactures children's clothing, and she's there to get the next tranche of clothing out. And I've discovered about Indian business by watching her the last 25 years. And she's been quite successful. I mean, there are all sorts of issues. We're not talking about that, which we can, about Indian business and how one operates. But I'll just say a bottom line. She has to go back and forth a lot, because you have to have in India, in management, it's been my experience, you must have hands-on management. So thank you for mentioning that. I'll mention to her that you mentioned her in your introductory remarks. I have just a few statements I want to make. And I'm going to keep my comments short, because as a teacher, I've long recognized the most valuable part of teaching is questions and answers. So to give as much time to that as possible. I just have a few comments I want to make initially on the previous speaker, and that is how the Europeans responded to the Ukrainian desire for NATO membership. In fact, in the Ukrainian constitution, they even placed a segment, which is partly what makes the Russians so upset, that Ukraine should go into into NATO and the European Union. The European Union is not a military alliance; it's more of an economic grouping. So that is less dangerous to the Russians or less upsetting to the Russians than is joining NATO. The Europeans have never backed that. They have resisted that, as have the United States. So this has not been a European effort. In fact, quite the contrary. The Europeans don't disagree with no boots on the ground either. A lot of this could change if guerrilla warfare develops. That is, if the Russians take over much of Ukraine. And it looks like there would be, because one thing that I think we have to keep in mind is the Ukrainian people have responded in rage to what's happening. All one has to do is see the TV of people going to the border and their husbands going back to fight in the war. And this is from all parts of the country. I don't think anybody expected that, and certainly Putin didn't expect that he would arouse the kind of rage which will not go away for a long period of time. And in fact, it wasn't only rage in Ukraine. I mean, the international support of Zelensky and the Ukrainians is really quite amazing. Give you one example. When he spoke to the British Parliament, first time ever that a foreign leader has spoken to the British Parliament to a person got up and cheered him. And I'll say a few things about some of the surprising context of this invasion. Let's say what it is. It is an invasion. It is not special operations. It is an invasion involving bombing, in fact, bombing of hospitals and maternity hospitals as well. So that is to say, it's indiscriminate. So anyway, let me say a couple of things on the geopolitics. As I said, I want to keep it as short as possible, so we'd have as much time for questions and answers as possible. One thing that the previous speaker mentioned that I think is absolutely right is the results of the invasion took everyone by surprise. No one expected that the Ukrainians would put up such severe resistance. And this is all parts of the country. And interestingly enough, it also includes the Russian speakers in Ukraine as well. This kind of resistance could never have happened had there not been mass popular support. Putin hasn't helped by bombing civilian areas in the cities, including hospitals, orphanages. And in fact, the most recent thing I just saw this morning is that in Mariupol, a city in the south, up to 1,500 people may have been killed in the assaults on civilian areas. Just think what happens when Kiev, when the fight goes on, it'll be block by block with all the kind of killing that accompanies that sort of thing. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is, everyone was taken by surprise, not by the invasion or the incursion, because the Russians have done that before when they took Kiev and they established these two rump republics in the far east of the country. But I think what everyone was surprised was by the resistance, and especially President Zelensky's really dramatic way of standing for the cause of Ukraine. No one really expected that. This is a man who had been a comedian. Jewish, by the way. So when the Russians say denazification, I almost laugh because not only is he a Jew, but his defense minister is a Jew as well. So you have two Jews, presumably, being Nazis. I mean, it is so ridiculous to anybody who knows that it's hard to sort of take any of this quite seriously. So the kind of mass public response, I think, is one thing. The other thing is somewhat interesting that hadn't really been expected is the European response to what has happened. NATO was in many ways, had been weakened by lack of a goal and objective. The percentage of budgets to military were below the 2% that had been proposed. In fact, it was for some countries, it was even below 1%. That has changed. The most dramatic change is Germany, which has said that right up front it's going to put $100 billion into military assistance. And the German press, from what I can see, is now talking about 2.5% a year in military. Germany is a big country with a big economy. That is a very significant thing. The other thing that Germany has done is it has decided to send military equipment to the Ukrainians, which before it had been unwilling to do. It had thought of itself in a kind of special arrangement with Russia. That has gone down the drain. And it is now desperately looking, there's a price to pay. And we may want to talk about in the questions and answers, and I assume one of our speakers will go into the economics of this whole situation as to how long, and what kind of economics, situation we face, particularly on energy. The other thing is that in the international community, it's beyond Europe. Look at the vote in the UN. 141 countries, voted to essentially accuse the Russians of invading, and recommended that they pull out, which they haven't done. And I'll say just a few things about that in my concluding remarks. But it's not just the Europeans who are providing, aid. It is also the North Americans, South Americans. I just saw statistics about where the assistance is coming. Even some from India, by the way. Some private assistance from India is going to various organizations to get to the Ukraine. I can't speak for her. I asked my wife to find out from her workers what they think about the situation. So I can't say anything about the popular reaction. But the popular reaction in the world has generally been very pro-Ukrainian and very anti-Russian. Putin did no favors to himself by this in terms of building up either his geostrategic presence or his popularity. The U.S., for any of those who watch the U.S., it's quite incredible. I just this morning turned on the TV. Every station is focused on Ukraine and the dangers that come from the kind of bombing that has taken place. And Zelensky has been something not only in much of Europe, but in the U.S. He's become a hero. He's probably the most popular political person in the United States. Who would have thought that 2 or 3 weeks ago? And most people didn't even know who he was. Everyone knows who he is now, and he's very shrewd. Maybe his background as an actor has helped him, to be effective. Some people have said that in that respect, anyway, Prime Minister Modi is similar, because Prime Minister Modi also has something of an acting background. Who he himself has written that as a boy and a young man he loved acting, and through acting saw the power of words. I think the same is true with Zelensky. The other thing it's done, particularly in Europe and the US, is it has strengthened the sense of NATO as an organization. As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, there was a sense that NATO, lacking a purpose, had weakened support, and that was seen in lower defense budgets. That's changed. Defense budgets virtually across, throughout Europe and the US, by the way, are going up, and with mass popular support. In fact, the decision of the U.S. not to send, not to be part of this plane deal that Poland has suggested, has actually met a lot of resistance. And by some people, I would never have expected to be critical of it. Senator Romney, for example, was very critical. Senator Durbin, a Democrat, was very critical. So you have a kind of bipartisan criticism saying the U.S. should do that. What difference does it make if it's a Stinger, which proved so valuable in Afghanistan in knocking down planes, or an airplane? But so far the U.S. has been cautious on that. That obviously it doesn't want to take steps that would lead to direct confrontation between the U.S., NATO, and any Russians. And then finally, on terms of surprises, is the universal support for the Ukrainian, and that's just continuing as information gets out about the destruction that's taking place. Wars today, and I'm sure the generals and those you in the military know this much better than I, is quite different in terms of how it's portrayed. You now have cell phones that can take pictures. You now have all sorts of modern technology that can get information out quickly. It's very difficult to close it off. In fact, one of the interesting things about the impact on Russia, since Putin has virtually closed down all of the quote unquote non-state journalism, is that information gets in. And I'll say a few things about China. I taught in China for 10 years, not full time, but on and off. And there are all sorts of rules in China about things you couldn't access. I had a student one day came up to me after one of my classes and said, there are all sorts of ways to get international news. And then he instructed. I didn't want to get in trouble. But the point is, almost all my students, despite those restrictions, watched Western television and listened to Western news. That's going to happen in Russia as well. It's impossible to cut off all of this. Technology is just too powerful for that to happen. And the government in Russia is now beginning to impose various harsh penalties on those who do so. But I think it's still going to happen. And word spreads fast. And particularly as Russian dead young men start coming back in body bags. Internationally, the reaction of mothers, and this was true of the Russians in Afghanistan, one of the reasons that the Russians eventually moved out is popular support for the war there was rapidly diminishing as more and more young Russian men began coming back. And that's happening now. How many have died? Figures vary. The Russians themselves admit to 500 or 600. And the Ukrainians say 15,000, 16,000. Figures I've seen from the US government is it's somewhere in between. But that's a big number. If you're talking about maybe 2, 3, 4, 5,000 body bags coming back and for all over the country, that's going to have an impact. People are going to wonder, what are we doing this for? What are we gaining from all of this? Were we threatened by the Ukrainians? Were we threatened by NATO to the extent that this, it means that we have all these thousands of people, young people who are dying? So what are some of the geopolitical consequences of this? And I suspect it's going to last. In fact, I agree with the previous speaker that one of the real possibilities is guerrilla warfare could develop. And if that happens, my guess is Europe and other countries are going to help the rebels. They just will. That makes geostrategic sense in the situation where you have not only the kind of violence that's taking place, but also the geostrategic consequences of what the Russians have just done. However, I don't think it's really, people say, oh, and Mearsheimer, who, by the way, was one of my instructors at the University of Chicago, as he was a young man at the time he came there, a brilliant man, but I don't agree with him that it was totally NATO that did this, or even largely NATO who did this. Even Putin hasn't said that. He later said that as a justification. He started out with the idea is we're going to involve in denazification against these Jews who are there in control of Ukraine. And what he meant by that really was to eliminate the leadership. He could put a pro-Russian puppet government in charge. So the justification was broader. There was talk about the Ukrainians being harsh on the Russians, and this is particularly about the fight in the Donbass region to the east. and other places. Ukraine has a very large percentage, large Russian-speaking population. The estimates I've seen is maybe as high as 20, 25%, which is significant. And in some places they are a majority, in some parts of the east and far south. And the question is, to what extent, did you have it? And in fact, there has been, not unusual in the world, in Ukraine, a nationalism that has tended to focus on encouraging Ukrainian as a language in schools, broadcasts, and other things. A lot of Russians have not been particularly happy, but but you had nothing. But you have now in terms of refugees. You now have 2.5 million people who have left. The numbers are likely to go higher. That's creating an enormous humanitarian crisis. If you had, I've seen a figure. You may have maybe 10,000 Russians who have left, Russian speakers, 10,000 over the last 10 years. Nothing. So obviously, the kind of effort to nationalize events there didn't have the same kind of fear, resulted in the same kind of fear among Russians. The question is, the other thing, impact is how this has united American politics on foreign policy. American politics, as for those of you who follow it, the last couple of years has not been united on almost anything between the Democrats and Republicans, conservative and liberals. I mean, they can still govern. There are some issues that still, basic issues of governance that still are the same. On this issue, and that has spread to foreign policy in general, there has been unanimity in supporting the Ukrainians and unanimity. And in fact, the issue is rage is beginning to develop in this country as they see hospitals being bombed, and they see the kind of results that has led to this indiscriminate bombing, in part because I don't think the Russians, one, had thought that this was going to happen. And so they didn't have a strategy to deal with it. And their previous strategy when they were in Syria and in the Chechen Republic was, blast them to hell and hope that you win by that. And in these two cases, they were able to achieve a lot. But the Ukrainian situation is somewhat different. We can probably go into that later. China is interesting. I think in many ways the Chinese and Indians have a very similar response. Both want good relations with Russia, and both are unwilling to speak out. That's why I'd be curious what the popular reaction in India is. As a democracy, India has to eventually begin to reflect what its people think about this issue. So I don't know. Maybe someone here can, maybe there's been some polls taken on that. Both of these countries would like the situation to end. My former colleagues at Tongji University in Shanghai, where I taught, tell me as discreetly as they can, because they know the emails that go out of the country are probably being read, that the Chinese, the Chinese view is that the fighting should end because it can lead to a long-term problem for China. The other issue, that someone mentioned, China in the Indian context. The Chinese argue that Arunachal Pradesh is Chinese. When I first went to China and I looked at maps of the world, and because one of the classes they asked me to teach was on India, and I thought, that's strange. This map doesn't look like maps I've seen, before. All of Arunachal Pradesh is listed as Chinese. The Chinese insist, like they do in the case of Taiwan, it must someday be Chinese. Well, what will happen if the Chinese, take from if there isn't a kind of real pushback on what the Russians have done in Ukraine? What lessons will they learn on Taiwan? But more than Taiwan, what lessons will they learn on India? I can tell you the Chinese consider themselves far stronger than the Indians, and in some ways they are. Their military is much stronger. Could they march into Arunachal Pradesh? My guess is they'd have as much trouble there as they would, not only because of popular resistance, but the Indian army is stronger than the Ukrainian army in many ways. And India is, let's not forget, is a nuclear weapons power as well. So what needs to be done as this war drags on? So far, there have been a few helpful signs about some kind of consultation and meetings. There have been some hints that they're willing to compromise. And for the Russians, that would have to be something on NATO And for the Ukrainians, it would have to be something about leaving the country, leaving the Ukrainian integrity intact. I'm not sure what's going to happen. Partly the sanctions may have an impact, and the sanctions have had an impact. One should just read the Wall Street Journal if you're interested in that the last couple of days. They've had some interesting articles on the impact of the sanctions on Russia. And contacts I know tell me that it's beginning to have a major impact on that, and as companies, and not just American companies, European companies, and some companies in South America are beginning to totally withdraw. And one of the most recent has been some of the fast food restaurants that have sprung up in Russia. So I think what the world has to, is push. One is to get the Russians to stop the bombing of civilian areas, one. Two is to encourage any kind of meetings that would be held. And I think that there's room for compromise. In fact, Zelensky has just made some statements suggesting that the NATO issue could be responded to by the Ukrainians, and I think it would be helpful if they did. Because, in some ways, as the previous speaker mentioned, Ukraine so sticks into Russia, and many Russians see NATO as a dangerous situation for them in the long term, not the present term. Ukraine, NATO in no way threatens Russia in the present situation. It could if the situation there gets out of hand. It really could, and that's why I think it's up to the world to begin to put real pressure on the Russians and the Ukrainians to negotiate, for the Russians to withdraw, and maybe for the Ukrainians to make some kind of statement about their military neutrality, somewhat in the way that Switzerland is militarily neutral. But the interesting thing about Switzerland is they have also sent, for the first time, they have sent assistance to a country that's engaged in warfare. Let me stop there, because I thought I'd keep my remarks limited, because I think the Q's and A's will be more interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Anderson. I'm glad that you came to our forum for the first time and gave a very, very, reality-based, grounded, viewpoint from the US and Western perspective. And that coming, from your academic and, geopolitical experience. And sometimes, we say that academicians actually sometimes build castles in the air. And it reminds me of Professor Francis Fukuyama, who had predicted the end of the history. And as we sit here, we are witnessing history being made, good or bad, but that is what it is. So I'm glad that you gave a very balanced presentation as an academician, very reality-based, very ground-based. And I hope that we have, benefit of your wisdom and scholarship in future. I am going to invite our next speaker, who is General Dhruv Katoch. General Katoch, the floor is yours. Try to, summarize your presentation within 10 to 12 minutes. And I give the floor to you, General Katoch.
Thank you, Dr. Adityanji. I'll actually stick to 10 minutes. Now, I want to talk about three specific things, certain imperatives, scenarios, and futures. Now, let me first talk of the imperatives. The Russian imperative is the Black Sea, period. If you look to the north of Russia, 13,000 plus kilometers of coast, which they cannot access for most of the year. So their only access remains to the warm waters is the Black Sea. They will never, ever compromise that interest. Number two, to halt NATO expansion. They want a friendly regime in Kyiv. And number three, I think they are prepared now with this war to sacrifice their economic interests to retain their long-term strategic interests. For Ukraine, I think Ukraine has been caught between a very hard place and a rock. If Zelensky bows down now, then the people will ask him, why did he go to the war? And if he doesn't bow down, he risks the destruction of his country. So he's got a very difficult choice to make. And I really don't think he's got, let's see how he negotiates this particular patch, regardless of the fact that he's an actor. Third, I think for the US and NATO, it is a test of their credibility. Right. I won't amplify any of these points. Now, I want to get onto a few scenarios. Here, this is the military part of it. Now, one, Russia actually captures Kyiv, and it does it very quickly. They change the government and they withdraw. I think that's the important part of it. This is the best scenario for Russia. Will it take place? They are about 10 to 12 kilometers from Kyiv as of now. Will Kyiv buckle down? I don't know. We really don't know which way this war is going to go. It could go either way. But if they buckle down, if the government is changed and it is done quickly, then Russia has got an escape. Russia has got an escape route, and I think it'll do good to get back peace into this area. The second part of it is Russia actually captures Kyiv but does not withdraw. Now that is going to lead to a very, very complicated situation. And, then they'll find themselves in a place as bad as it was when they were in Afghanistan. They will be bled over the years, and I don't think the Russian president would like a scenario of that nature. Ultimately, you see, here is where I have certain points of differences with Professor Anderson, but on this point, I agree with him. Russia cannot control Ukraine without the support of the people, and I think this war has made them lose a large part of that support. Fourth future, what happens to the Indo-Pacific? I think what has really happened is that we have shifted focus now from what, let me put it this way. I think the West has shifted focus now from what should have been its primary strategic challenge. They have shifted that focus and gone on to propping up Ukraine to fight a war there using the Ukrainians to fight the Russians. It is a proxy war. And while doing this proxy war, I think they have lost sight of the larger objective. The larger objective remains China, which will remain the major strategic threat of the United States for India and for all the democracies of the world. So futures. One, there is going to be a shift in the geostrategic balance. I think that era of unilateral initiatives which were taken by the United States, that era is over. The US can no longer come and say, we will bomb Iraq. They can no longer say, we will take over Lebanon. They control the narrative, yes. But I think that era is over when they can go into third world countries, replace rulers at the whims and fancies who do not conform to what their idea of democracy is, or rather, who do not really conform to their geo-economic interests. Let me put it a bit more bluntly. The future of NATO. You see, NATO should have been disbanded when the Soviet Union collapsed, but it didn't. Okay. And it was becoming reasonably defunct, as President Trump said. But now, for the first time, NATO has realized it needs to get its act together. They can no longer rely on their defense on the United States. I think that is the message which is coming across, which is why Germany is doubling its budget from 50 to 100 billion. Japan is going to militarize, and you will find all the other NATO countries militarizing. Now, where are the weapons going to come from? I think when you look at the big arms suppliers and who is going to get that money, most of it is in the United States. While NATO will militarize, I think, and once they start becoming stronger, they will detach to a great extent from the United States also. They will be an independent pole. And I think that would serve their interests far better than being attached and conforming to the policies as given out by the United States. On energy, while Germany has, as per the statements given today, they have said that by 2027, they will have alternate sources of supply. But despite alternate sources of supply, I think the dependence on Russian gas and energy will remain. You may have alternate sources for emergencies, but when you're looking at sheer economics, No way. That dependency will remain. What we are witnessing now is a Cold War taking place. It is an alliance of democracies on one side versus the dictatorships, that is Russia and China, on the other. And we have allowed that to happen. This should not have been allowed to happen. And I think here, this is where NATO, the European Union, and the rest of the world, or the democracies have gone horribly wrong. You have chosen the wrong enemy. Russia was never your enemy. You should have chosen your long-term strategic threat remains China, and they will come to know that in the years to come. This is the way I have read the situation. So a new Cold War is in the offing. So how will these alliances shape out? So do we see now an alliance, China, Russia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, some sort of an axis developing this way? An alternate pole developing Israel, India, the Saudis, and the Emirates. NATO becoming another pole. The United States, of course, is an independent pole. Are we looking into something like that? I don't know. But those possibilities remain, and it is a future scenario. Taiwan. Professor Anderson spoke about what happens if China takes, the China can fight Arunachal. Let me give you my view. There will be at some point in future a war between India and China. No question about it. The question is not whether there will be a war. There will be a war. The question is when. So regardless of the fact that this particular conflict is taking place in Ukraine, or that is an incidental sideshow, this conflict between India and China is going to take place. And it will take place when China feels it is confident it can win. I don't think they're going to win, so that conflict may not take place at all. But as far as Chinese calculations are there, they will fight. As per my calculations, let them fight, we will win. They will be defeated on those high Himalayas. There are different reasons for that, but I won't get into it. Taiwan. 100 miles of sea, a tremendous obstacle separates China from Taiwan. If you wish to take Taiwan, it has to be an aerial assault. That means you've got to land your paratroopers there, or you've got to land your troops by shore. I think a very large part of the Chinese air and naval power will be destroyed in that attempt. So a military invasion of Taiwan is not going to be as simplistic as what people are thinking. China will be shown what it is really worth. What they will really like to do is to carry out a power change within Taiwan and get those people to actually join them. Will that take place? Well, let's see. But militarily, in my personal view, and I'm giving my professional opinion, I think they're going to be in for a very, very hard time. Trade. You see, it's very funny. America has imposed a lot of sanctions on everybody, on Russia, and they said that. Have you noticed they haven't put any sanctions on palladium? Why? America needs palladium. They haven't imposed any sanction on energy. Why? Germany needs that gas. So it is, these are statements of intent of convenience. They are doing what is convenient to them, what is economically suitable to them. But otherwise, I think otherwise, I'm not very, very sure of the game which the United States, NATO, and the European countries are playing. In my view, they are still using Ukraine. They will fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian. That's the way I have looked at this particular conflict. So coming back to the last bit, India. Now, this is not our war, but we are impacted. India, after 2 years of getting out of COVID, and our economy just started getting up, we cannot afford a spike in energy prices, and that spike is going to take place. So it is in our interest to get this war over quickly, whichever way it goes. But it has to be a done and dusted deal, and then the world can get back to living. But I think the policy which we have followed is a very, very stable policy. We will not get into any particular corner. It is not that we are non-aligned. I think non-aligned is the wrong word. We will continue with strategic autonomy. And what does our strategic autonomy dictate at this point of time? It dictates stay out of it. This is a European war. Let them fight their war. Just two or three small points. One, the role of the media. Yesterday, I spoke on the Indian Institute of Mass Communication, and I gave my views on media. The media is a tremendous force multiplier. I think India must learn that lesson. We've done it quite well, but today the entire news, the news which we are getting fed into the Indian mainstream is from Western sources. So you're getting a Western viewpoint. And yesterday I was horrified, you see, because there were so many pictures coming of, 3 people had been killed, one lady, a child, and a man crossing a bridge. And they said, Russia should be tried for war crimes. Right. I'm very sorry that those 3 children died. 200,000 Iraqi children have died. Nobody bothered about them. Millions have been displaced. Nobody bothered about them. So why is it that black lives, brown lives don't matter, but white lives with blue eyes matter? This is something, unless we get rid of this hypocrisy, I don't think we can even talk about human rights. Why was it that America supported a genocide in Bangladesh? And they were prepared to fight India for that genocide. These are very uncomfortable questions. Why did they go into Libya to depose Gaddafi? Because he wanted to, disassociate himself from the American dollar. Now, these are very, very troubling questions, which I think the US needs to very seriously think over. What exactly are human rights are we talking about? It doesn't really work that way, right? And the last thing, as far as India is concerned, yep, we will maintain our strategic independence, and I have maintained my time limit within 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, General Katoch, for giving an Indian perspective and very correct Indian perspective about India's strategic autonomy moving on to India's strategic independence, because both are somewhat different aspects. And you did very eloquently, describe to us why this war was unnecessary, unfortunate, and how it could have been prevented just by taking some, wise preventive actions before all this started, especially about the issue of NATO. Let's not underestimate that. And now I have the honor of presenting to you our last but the most distinguished panelist, Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor, who has been on this forum multiple times, and last month was a distinguished, speaker on the strategic importance of Central Asia. So he will cap up this discussion on the Ukrainian crisis from his diplomatic and foreign service experience. Ambassador Kapoor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adityanji, for the great work that you do, and thank you to CSA for spreading knowledge about so many important issues which are topical. I am indeed very happy to see a lot of friends on this panel today who are listening to us on this very important subject. First of all, I would like to say that to me, it appears like a tale of two Vladimirs, one a comedian and one an autocrat. And between them, between these two, they have turned it into a very great tragedy. Ukraine or Ukraine. What is Ukraine to Europe particularly? It is the largest, geographically the largest state after Russia, occupying the maximum space in Europe. It has a medium-sized population of about 41, 42 million people. And between the two countries, the amount of raw materials, natural resources, crops, wheat, corn, energy, oil, minerals, metals that they supply to the global economy, global supply chains, is a very, very important factor for all of us to ponder about. I have been on many visits to what were, formerly part of USSR, the East European countries, and interacted a lot with the leadership there. And their views about NATO, about Western Europe, about Russia are very mixed. It is not a clear-cut case. I'm not going to repeat what the other speakers have said before, but I'll try to pitch in the issues which have not been addressed so far. So what I hear on the ground in my discussions with a lot of the leadership there is that they primarily do not want to be sucked into a conflict between the West and the East. They want to be left alone to lead their lives peacefully without any threats or threat perceptions. Now, going to the next step, did it need to come to this pass that you have a war which has disrupted the entire world? We had written a book recently which was Beyond COVID Pandemic, where we thought that we could write about a new world beyond the COVID pandemic. So the title we gave the book was Envisioning a Better World by Transforming the Future of Healthcare. And in that book, we talked about how the COVID pandemic was the most impactful incident happening in the world after Second World War, in many ways more impactful than a world war. It impacted people across all countries, across the globe, in so many significant ways. And the economic impact it had was also absolutely, phenomenal. Now, when we write about the Ukraine-Russia war in the future, we will realize that it is something which just adds to the misery of the world in so many ways beyond what the COVID has already done. Now, coming to historical lessons and perspectives, are we learning anything from history at all? Professor Anderson mentioned about Switzerland. No mention has been made about Austria, for example, in 1955, faced with a similar situation of NATO's ambitions and goals and interest to push its frontier towards Russia and the pushback from USSR at that time. What did Austria do? The Parliament of Austria passed a resolution that it will be permanently neutral. Until this day, it is permanently neutral. It is neither NATO nor bending on the other side. And there is peace in Austria, as we all know. Similarly, General Dhruv Katoch has mentioned about some aspects where all the world needs to reflect upon what their past lessons have. I've worked in Cambodia, I've worked in Chile, I've seen what CIA has done in those countries. I don't want to get into the details of all that now, but the damage that they have created is immense. And the narrative which dominates the world, as has already been mentioned, is a Western narrative. So that narrative never occupies a prime space in the mind or in the media anywhere in the world. But coming to 1962, when many of us were around, but some of us were not even born, the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. What happened? Russia tried to position some missiles in Cuba. What was US reaction? That no, you cannot position these missiles in Cuba because Cuba is too close for comfort to the mainland of USA. Mirror this position on what Russia is saying, that you cannot make Ukraine a member of NATO and position missiles in Ukraine because Ukraine is too close for comfort to Russia. How far is Moscow from Ukraine border? Not very far. Now, the border land, between Ukraine and Russia is very, very large, because Ukraine is a very large country. Now, if NATO in the future were to come into Ukraine at some stage and position missiles, the geopolitical and geostrategic threats to Russia would have been immense. Because if you have the Baltic states in the north already members of NATO, and then you have Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, it is enough to give every Russian strategist nightmares. So, Henry Kissinger has written about it, that whether the expansion of NATO eastwards was justified at all. He's raised very big questions. Professor Mersheimer, who was mentioned earlier in this conversation, he has given very, a large number of talks that this is absolutely unjustified. Thomas Friedman has written, who's a very well-known analyst and writer and thinker, that, NATO is equally to blame in all this. Now, as we say in Hindi, ताली एक हाथ से नहीं बजती, ताली दोनों हाथों से बजती है. So are we giving that a thought at all, that there is also a lot of blame on both sides? But what are we doing to the world in this sort of scenario? And if a common man, and I am in US saying I am going to impose sanctions on Russia selectively, what has been highlighted by General Katochalia, sanctions are going to hurt Russia, but are they going to hurt my people or not? Are my prices of gasoline the same, or have they shot up through the roof? I was in Florida yesterday. Prices there have shot very high. California, my son lives. The prices there are touching $6.50 a gallon. I was in Georgetown University in the faculty there in 91, 92 when the USSR, fell apart. That time the prices of gasoline were 99 cents to a gallon. Today they have already reached $4.50. Isn't the impact being felt on the common man in USA, in Europe, all over the world? Aren't these going to have multiplier impacts, because everything moves on wheels and wheels require gas? Already there is such a rise in prices in USA. When I go to shop for my grocery, my bills have increased easily by about 10-20% in terms of just ordinary grocery shopping. And I see the prices increase on a regular basis. Now, imagine the situation. Just sort of extrapolate the situation now and see what happens. So is this impact of sanctions only one-sided? The other aspect, between Russia and Ukraine, if they are producing such an amount of corn, such an amount of wheat, that the whole world prices of these crops and other crops are quite stable for so many years. Now they are totally disrupted. The bread basket is already disrupted. Then I hear some report just today, this morning, I read an analysis how the wheat crop in China has suffered very badly. Now, India, fortunately, is in a very good way in terms of its crops and its buffer stock of crops. But the pressure on those crops now already is phenomenal. So many countries are requesting for those crops from India, and the prices are shooting through the roof. So what are you doing? Whom are you benefiting with all this aspect? Now, was there a solution? Yes. If Ukraine, and if this comedian had any sense, I don't know how he's being made out to be a hero. I still see him as a very average or poor quality leader, personally. Because if I am looking after a country and I have to look after the long-term interests of my country, what do they sort of, force me to do? Think about the long-term interests of Ukraine. In that way, if I say, okay, currently we give it in writing, because Putin was asking in writing, either from NATO that they will not expand to Ukraine, or from Ukraine to say they will not join NATO. One statement along these lines by either party would have stopped this disaster from happening. Neither of the two sides did that. And now the narrative being controlled by the Western media is dictating to the world that only one side is entirely at fault. Is that a correct narrative? Now, who benefits in the long term? Who benefits? I mean, the armament industry all over the world, because for them it's now make hay while the sun shines. You keep on manufacturing more and more. Hundreds of billions of dollars worth of equipment demands are going to arise as we go in the days ahead. And who else? If I see the scenario tomorrow, suppose in one scenario which has been painted out earlier, that Russian objectives are attained, there is a neutral leadership installed in Ukraine, which does not join NATO and puts it in writing that they will not join NATO. And thereafter, what do we see in the global stage? Russia is strengthened. China is already strengthened. The Western side has become weaker. US has become weaker in the process because of inflation and local difficulties, and economic existence for an ordinary US citizen is a very, very prime motive of their existence. And if you have an existential threat in USA, imagine what can happen. Already there are predictions that food riots are going to break out in so many parts of the world within the next year or so. So imagine what you have done. Our main threat perception today, what is it? Are we focusing on that? South China Seas, China, the threats posed by China, the threats posed by terrorism. Are we getting stronger to face those threats, or are we making ourselves weaker to face those threats? Not terrorism. There are stories about jihadis being brought in by both the sides. We only hear about jihadis being brought in by one side, again because of the narrative issue. But what I learned from various sources is both the sides are bringing in jihadis who are open to be hired as mercenaries. Now you have a few thousand or tens of thousands of Islamic jihadis floating around in Ukraine, and tomorrow a resolution takes place. You think these jihadis will go back to where they came from? What are they going to do tomorrow to Europe? And can't we imagine these scenarios after all that has happened in the world before? You have a few tens of thousands of jihadis all over Europe with massive weaponry at their command, floating around all over the continent and having access to reach other parts of the world so easily from Europe. So I don't understand what we are doing to ourselves, very frankly, and why we are not seeing India position. I support it very strongly, not because I'm an Indian, but because I think it is the right position that both the sides, what do they have to do? Chapter 6 of United Nations Charter says negotiations. And what did India say repeatedly to Russia and to Ukraine? Negotiations, negotiations, negotiations. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Kapoor. As usual, you bring these, wisdom to these discussions on geopolitics and touch upon issues that nobody so far discussed. And I'm very pleased that you were able to, discuss those particular issues. So just I will share my screen here. Can people see? It is a quote from John Mearsheimer. If Ukrainians were smart, they would have divorced themselves from US and worked out a modus vivendi with Russia.
We cannot see your screen. I
Cannot see
cannot
my
see screen. No, I don't know about the others, but I don't see it. Okay, now I can see it.
Okay. If
See it now.
Ukrainians were smart, they would have divorced themselves from US and worked out a modus vivendi with Russia. If you are a reasonably small power in the international system and live next door to a gorilla, you have to go to a great lengths to accommodate that gorilla. That is what John Mearsheimer said he has been saying that since 2014, since Crimea issue, and actually he speaks on a forum called Buddhi for University of Chicago, which means wisdom. So there were voices in academia that were forewarning the consequences of this silly and senseless war, which is going to impact the whole world, as Ambassador Kapoor told us. It is true that some of the countries like India have no skin in the game as we speak in the West, but India is going to be impacted by this as well. But the important thing is, what do we do now? You know, we have this tale of two Vladimirs. On one hand, there's an autocrat. On the other hand, there's a comedian. The comedian has managed to win the information war, but has managed to get destroyed his country. That is where we are. So we have some questions here. I'm going to paraphrase the questions and read them out for the sake of brevity and to keep the discussion very succinct. So the first question is from Rita Dhawan and it is addressed to Professor Anderson. And it's a very pointed question. Has US ever had a desire or intent to invade and take over any other sovereign country in the world with intent to rule? Professor Walter Anderson, please respond to this. Do we have Professor Anderson?
There we go. Okay,
Yes.
the last time this happened was in the mid 19th century with the war between Mexico and the U.S. When we actually, in a sense, encouraged that war to seize what was almost half of Mexico, which is now including, as someone mentioned, they have a relative in the state of California, California and Nevada and much of the West beyond the Mississippi River. That was the last time we actually invaded to take it over. But I want to say something here that's kind of tangentially related to this. Many of the speakers have talked about this issue as if both sides are equally guilty. Even Mearsheimer doesn't say that, by the way. Russians invaded. The Ukraine did not invade any part of Russia. Russians invaded, and they're the ones engaged in killing. How many people, Ukrainians, do you see fleeing to Russia? I'm told it's in the small thousands. Millions have gone to Europe. So let's keep straight. Who is the invader in this case? Who is the one that needs to be pushed to prevent this thing from going on? It's one country it is, and that's Russia.
Thank you, Professor Anderson. The point of the fact of the point is that US did invade Mexico. Some of the US states as part of the Union are former Mexican territories, the Treaty of Guadalupe, and of course, you know, the state of Texas, which was, you know, declared autonomous independent republic from 1836 to 1846 when it was annexed by United States.
It wasn't annexed. It was not annexed. They had requested earlier to join the United States. The United States put that off, and then they agreed to that invitation from the legislature in Texas. So let's keep that straight.
Professor Anderson, I'm seeing a parallel with the Republic of Donetsk and Luhansk. They have actually requested to Russian Federation.
But who did that? Who requested? They were supported by Russian troops. Russia has been actually fighting in Ukraine since 2015.
I think we don't want to get emotional here, but there are parallels. And if you write a copybook, somebody will follow that copybook example. And that is what seems to be happening. I'll go on to the next question, and I will lump two questions. And these are from two different people. One is Lalit Mathur, and second is Ankush Bhandari. And both these questions are pertaining to NATO. And the questions are like this, that the war has started because of NATO trying to encircle Russia. NATO in Ukraine is a big nuisance as Pakistan has been to India. And the supplementary comment is, if the time has come to dismantle NATO, I will ask first General Dhruv Katoch and then request Professor Anderson to answer the same question. General Katoch, please.
Right. Thank you. But just before that, what Professor Anderson had spoken about, since just to put the record straight, since 2014 till now, over 30,000 people have been killed in the Donbass region. I don't think that speaks very, very well of the Zelensky government. As far as NATO is concerned, I think their relevance was over once the Soviet Union collapsed, and it should have been in order for Russia to have been co-opted into the European Union. We would have had a very strong cooperation and there would have been no possibility of war. That did not happen. And it has not happened not because of any particular country. I think it is the arms lobby, which is very, very strong and which dictates terms to the governments all across the world.
Professor Anderson, your comments on this issue?
In terms of NATO, whether it should survive as an entity, it will. And in fact, if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I might have said, well, I'm not sure. But today with this situation, and this is not going to be over quickly, this has only aroused the European countries to be even more committed to NATO. And by the way, even more committed to a relationship with the United States than was in the past, and vice versa. As you know, President Trump raised real doubts about the utility of NATO. He has actually been forced to pull back on that significantly because of both the public and response to the United States to that. So will it go anytime soon? I don't think so. Not only for two reasons. One, the NATO countries themselves are more committed to keeping it than in the past. And secondly, the situation in Russia, unless there's regime change in Russia, then I don't see this thing ending anytime soon. And by the way, it wasn't NATO that was the first reason the Russians gave for moving into Ukraine. It was the alleged persecution of Russian speakers, and the point that Putin made again and again was that Ukraine is not a state; it is part of Russia. And therefore, that presumably provided a justification for moving in and taking it.
Thank you, Professor Anderson. I'll go on to the next question. And this question is from Bindu Maharaj, who is in one of the Caribbean countries. And the question is, what are your views on the US rebuilding relationships with Venezuela and Iran, given their tense histories? And question is actually to Professor Anderson, but after Professor Anderson, I'll take a couple of counter viewpoints from our other panelists. Professor Anderson, what do you think about US rebuilding relationship with Venezuela and Iran?
Well, they have not been good for a whole variety of reasons, but there is a move now, and someone else brought up, the issue of energy and sort of making up for the fall in the import of Russian energy. Venezuela has one of the largest energy resources in the world, oil and gas, and so there have been approaches to the government there. And Iran also, but less, because Iran is further away and its industry has in fact deteriorated significantly. So is the one in Venezuela, but nonetheless, it's closer at hand and there's more to be had. So, does economics impact on foreign policy? Ambassador Kapoor surely knows that's often the case, where economic issues are an input in it. But we shouldn't forget public opinion, particularly in democracies, counts. And so there is enormous pushback in the U.S., for those of you who've been following the U.S. press, against better relations with Iran and with Venezuela. So we'll see what happens. I think the gas prices will go up. Who will be harmed by that? It'll be Biden, and the Democrats will be harmed by that. And so the Republicans are pushing that very hard, that this is a case where Biden should have managed foreign relations sufficiently well to have avoided that. And I think your own prime minister has been very wise in many ways in how he's handled the issue.
I will break this question into two parts and invite two of our panelists to speak on each separate aspects. So I will invite General Hasnain to talk about possibility of US rapprochement with Iran, considering the new geopolitical reality and energy needs that US will need.
It makes immense sense. To my perception, it makes immense sense for the United States to have a rapprochement with Iran. Now, I'm not sure that this can be achieved very easily in any way. Going back in history, you see what happened in 1979 and 1980 in Iran in terms of what happened to the US embassy, what happened to those 54 hostages who were taken at that particular time. I'm not sure whether the United States is willing to forgive and forget, because it's very deeply ingrained in the psyche of the US, of the nation, actually, of the leadership and the nation as such. And it's because of this that, for many reasons, you find that Iran could have been of great strategic importance to the United States. Access into the new great game areas of Central Asia, for example, the soft underbelly of Russia, the Soviet Union, for example, countering China. I mean, that's a huge thing, because after all, Iran is a very important part of the Belt and Road Initiative today also. All this, of course, is linked very largely to the fact that after 2003, the whole issue was, got ingrained with the nuclear aspect, and Iran's very avowed kind of enmity with Israel. And this complicated the whole thing. But I think things seem to be emerging out of it today. What's happened in Vienna, I'm not sure where we are heading exactly in the right direction. But what we are learning is that things may just sort themselves out in there. And you may find the beginning of a new US-Iran relationship. If something can be worked out with Israel, that much would be that much better. But I, in my perception, feel this is the time for the US to actually make a rapprochement with Iran.
And the second part of question, I will ask our panelist, Ambassador Kapoor. What are the chances of, rekindling the romance between United States and Venezuela, considering that today's geopolitical condition and the energy needs of the Western world?
Just two quick comments to answer that question. The title of the discussion today is Ukraine Crisis and Superpower Games. So that answers one part of the question, superpower games. The second comment is Marta Kani Karta. Just to translate it for the benefit of the others, when you are in very dire straits, then you have to explore all options. Now, just coming back to the comment by Professor Walter Anderson about Russia being to blame for the war. We were not discussing about the war. We were discussing about the incidents which led to this war, where a lot of scholars all over the world have said that blame has to be shared by both the sides, or the three sides: Ukraine, Europe and NATO, and Russia. It is not a one-sided game that the incidents which led to this war can only be pinned down on one side. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kapoor. There are a lot of questions, but we are already beyond our time, so I'm not going to take any more questions at this juncture. All I would say that this war is totally unnecessary. It was totally avoidable. It is in no one's interest on this planet to have this war go on. There is a need for immediate ceasefire and need for dialogue and discussion on the table by both the parties under a neutral broker. The broker has to be neutral. It will require stopping demonization of political leaders of either country and arriving at a lasting solution that would be acceptable to parties that are concerned without much, gaming going on for the future. We already are seeing that the gas prices are increasing. Both Russia and Ukraine are the wheat baskets of the world. So the fear of, hunger rights, food rights is really serious. So apart from our entrenched, deeply held emotional viewpoints, jingoistic and nationalistic viewpoints, the time has come for humanity to intervene in this war, moderate the influence on both the parties so that further loss of lives, destruction of property, and, sort of destruction of property as well as the peaceful environment. Unfortunately, my worry is that it is a European tribal war. And if you know the history, European tribal wars have been the precursors of world wars. And nobody wants a world war at this point in time. So we hope that the saner, councils will prevail on all the sides. And rather than finding allies here and there and expecting quid pro quos, the onus lies on peaceful resolution of this conflict for sake of humanity. With those comments, I thank our great panelists. I also thank our audience who have taken almost 2 hours of their schedule on a Saturday morning and attended this important, discussion. It is indeed a very important discussion because from 5:30 a.m. this morning, I was attending a similar discussion organized by Indic Researchers Forum in New Delhi that actually overlapped with this particular program. So it is of seriousness to all of us. I would also like to thank our team, TMCSA, Team Council for Strategic Affairs, mainly Mr. Ripudaman Pachauri, Mr. Ankush Bhandari, and Mr. Rajiv Verma, who helped me plan, execute, and arrange these programs. So give them a round of applause. And with all your participation, these wise, deliberative discussions are possible. And I hope that these discussions contribute eventually to world peace and prosperity rather than destruction of property and human life. Namaskar. Thank you very much indeed to everybody.
Namaste. Thank you.
Namaste, Dr. Aditya.